Välkommen till Stolpe Stories, en podcast om litteratur och humaniora från bokförlaget Stolpe. Vår värd för programmet heter Svante Tirén.
Det verkar som att människan i alla tider har varit djupt fascinerad av naturen. Men när började man samla på stenar och snäckskal och pressade växter, det som vi kallar för naturaliesamlande? Och varför blev det här ett så stort och viktigt fenomen genom historien? Clive Astlett är en av författarna till boken Naturaliesamlandet i historien. Han har skrivit om hur samlandet gick från att vara ett exklusivt nöje för adel och kungligheter till en folkrörelse för modern naturvetenskap. I dagens avsnitt så intervjuas han på länk från England och förklarar mer om samlandets mysterium. Welcome to the podcast, Clive.
Thank you.
Is it possible to say a time period when collecting natural history objects, let's say, is more of a thing, more of something we can recognize as a movement or something? We talk often about the Renaissance as a starting point here. What do you say?
Well, I think that's true. I think there were two traditions which came together. One was that plants, thinking particularly of plants were very important for medicine. Plants were really the basis of all medicine. So everybody was interested in plants. And to produce a herbal, which is a book of plants with illustrations, those were sponsored by very senior people across Europe, including Lord Burleigh, who was Queen Elizabeth's Chancellor, for example. But of course the herbals had rather crude illustrations, so it would have been much better to have collected plants and pressed them so that you could see the plant in detail. It was obviously rather important that you got the right plant when you were giving somebody medicine. So I think the tradition of using plants in medicine was important. And then there was another one, which was to do with the Wunderkammer, the Cabinet of Curiosities, which every great prince of the Renaissance and the Baroque wanted to have, and that was a kind of reflection of the world as a whole. They wanted to collect things which were representative of just everything and have them in this. It was a macrocosm in the microcosm, the greatest extent of the world in the tiniest space. And that's what they aimed for, and collecting plants was part of that because they were so much part of the wonder and excitement of nature, particularly when trade was expanding and people were going to new places.
So one could say, I mean, the fascination has always been there. There has been numerous practical uses, as you say, as well. But then, of course, when it's becoming a thing, it's when it sort of becomes a scientifically ambitious thing, something you want to use as understanding the world around you a little bit, like the Wunderkammer, as you said.
Yes, I think that's true. And it was particularly associated with the European empires, which were expanding all over the world. And so people were going out over the world, and collections were made by the people who travelled, who could be, for example, ship's captains, or they could be missionaries, or they could be merchants in far-flung places. Scientifically inclined people, I wouldn't quite call them scientists because the idea hadn't really evolved by then, but people who were interested in science were keeping up a correspondence with these people who had to go to very far away places and begging them to send them plants.
Mm. And that's an important point, because I think today, of course, we categorize this as a scientific endeavor, don't we? I mean, making herbariums and writing down their names and species and so on.
Well, that's true. And of course, that remains the case, that they have an important role in science still.
They do. But at the same time, of course, we have to remember that for the most part of this history, it's a deeply religiously felt world experience. And most people collecting this are not yet ready to demystify the world. On the contrary, it's actually connecting you more to the world and perhaps even spiritual notions of the world.
Yes, of course, when, for example, Linnaeus was assembling his wonderful herbarium, which I'm proud to say, by a kind of curious chain of events, exists here in London, he thought that God had created everything and that the natural world didn't change. Of course, obviously, we now know that isn't true. What he was collecting was a snapshot in time. But people felt that by assembling great collections and categorizing them, in Linnaeus's case, they were approaching close to the order that God had instilled in the world. That was their view of it. So there was a strong religious element, in the sense that there was a religious element. That was their worldview. Their collecting was conforming to this worldview.
It confirmed the godly sort of influences here. It did not deny it.
No, and of course, people were very, very excited when Europeans started to go to places they were unfamiliar with across the globe. They were finding these really extraordinary and wonderful things, which were simply amazing, in our case, to people who lived in Northern Europe, where just the colours of the tropics and the shapes and the extraordinary forms that animals could take or plants could take, those were wonders to them. So they were very excited by it.
Is that one of the main challenges today? I mean, when we look back at this history, I mean, we can just Google anything and immediately see pictures and so on. Of course, it's hard to imagine this sense of magic that must have been felt.
Well, I think that, as you say, the internet, we can see anything at the click of a mouse. And so often when people go on holiday, what they're seeing is the images they've already seen on the internet. But I think there is still wonder to be found. And as a matter of fact, if I could say, I think that Stolpe, in producing this fabulous book, or producing this book fabulously with these wonderful pictures, is an illustration of that. We can still be amazed because we're looking at things, for example, microscopically. We're seeing things, and this is the case in this book, which has been fabulously photographed with some of the herbarium samples in the collection being backlit and others looked at in great detail. We're seeing things, thanks to photography and these techniques, which you can't see with your naked eye. So I think there is still, and of course this is wonderful because you're understanding structures and patterns that you didn't even know were there in an ordinary everyday object. So I think this is a subject of wonder, I think. We still have the capacity to amaze ourselves.
So despite all the technical digital wonders, there is still a magic around the real thing, let's say.
Yes, and the real thing is very important in terms of science. These herbarium samples are very important. For one thing, the ones which were collected in the past, such as the ones in the Tim Herbarium, they show the world we know that this was what the world was like at a certain period, and we can see that this is what the plants were like, often on the very day, and knowing the place that they were collected. Well, of course, because of changes being speeded up through global warming and so on, the world is developing all the time. So it's important to scientists to know, to have an absolute record of how something was at a certain time. And the other thing which is important is that collected specimens provide the kind of type so that scientists can know exactly what a species is. When they go plant collecting, they may not go at a time when, for example, plants are in flower or even have seeds. It may be a different time of year. So it isn't always very easy to tell one specimen from another in the field. But in the herbariums that are kept at places like Kew, this is the yardstick of all science in botany.
That's so true. I mean, apart from the, let's say, psychological importance of seeing the objects and experiencing them, there is hardcore scientific value in the sense that they are actual photographs of what certain species, certain plants, what nature looked like at certain points in history. So it's not only nostalgia, it's actually relevant today.
Yes, and I was surprised in researching the book to find that herbariums, which I knew a little about in terms of history, but that they are so critically important today. Of course, people like Joseph Banks, who was the great botanist who travelled with Cook on his expeditions around the world, Captain Cook, he had an important herbarium, which is now in the Natural History Museum, and it had hundreds of thousands of specimens. Of course, now the herbariums that places like you have are in millions of specimens, but it does remain important.
It's extraordinary quantities. It's interesting because I find that, and I had this experience myself, that on the outside, you think that, when you study the collecting of natural objects, of natural history collecting, you think it's going to be quite niche, quite sort of specific in the sense that it's a practice revolving these plants and these specimens and so on. But in fact, you find an extraordinary mix of how this influences art, science, philosophy, thinking, linking the world. It's a very rich and sometimes even confusing history. What would you say as an art historian going into to this field.
Oh yes, I think that is certainly true. And of course, in the sort of broader span of culture, I mean, it was something, for example, that Shakespeare was very, very interested in, and he was associated with the movement to create wonderful herbals. And if you read his plays, there are loads of references to plants, some of which were very recently introduced. So he had a very keen interest in the subject. But you can see in painting, for example, that many different stages of European development, artists have been very keen to minutely represent the natural world, sometimes in an illusionistic way. And in the 17th century, for example, illusionism, the kind of tricking the eye into thinking that something which was in two dimensions was really three-dimensional, that in itself was regarded as a part of science because it was part of optics. But recording, if you think of the wonderful Dutch masters, recording flowers and butterflies and so on, with the flowers with tiny droplets of dew on their leaves. It was an amazing achievement, but it shows the absolute fascination. Of course, very often the paintings had a kind of undertow that this great beauty that there was in the natural world wasn't going to last, and that the plants would die and we would all die.
The whole Vanitas genre, right?
Yes, exactly.
No, it's interesting how existentially charged it is, isn't it? Because I suppose, as you say, many of these paintings who are extraordinary depictions of flowers and plants, and I mean, although they of course have sometimes, or very often of course, religious undertones or sort of some kind of message, the pure fascination and power in those depictions, in capturing colors and textures and little things. I mean, it's still, I think, today an art form to which a lot of people who have no interest in art can still feel marvel.
Yes, of course, in earlier ages, the Vanitas paintings had this melancholy subtext that all things would be lost. But in a sense, now there's a sort of greater relevance because, or a different resonance, really, because we are very anxious about the way the natural world is threatened. And so, quite apart from our own mortality, there's the thought that actually these plants, which we're used to coming up year after year in the spring, perhaps not all of them will. And I think that, that gives it a sort of special charge in our own day.
The climate crisis, of course, is something that has yet again brought existential charge, let's say, to this whole thing. And
yes.
I suppose it's a new kind of melancholy, but perhaps also one that in a way connects us more to what was felt by people in history looking at these things, and also having the religious wonders and the whole sort of idea that a plant or something is a reflection of something divine, of a higher order, of mystical things, basically, no?
Yes, I think that as formal religion is on the decline, I think that people take more interest in nature, perhaps as an alternative, as a refuge, but there are also a very strong desire to preserve what we have. I was in North Carolina recently, where the Venus flytrap, that's where the Venus flytrap comes from, this extraordinary carnivorous plant, which, I mean, that is in itself a wonder, although everybody, probably knows about it and you can buy one in a florist. Actually, it's extraordinary to see them growing in the wild. And they come from this very specific area of North Carolina near Wilmington. Great care is being taken by some people to preserve these plants. Unfortunately, they're stolen by others. But with this and other plants, there are campaigns which people put a lot of money into to restore plants. And that's a wonderful thing in itself, I think. I was a trustee of Plant Life, which is a charity about wildflowers, and some of the work that they did to bring back species that were on the brink of disappearing was really very inspiring.
It touches you. Now, the gallery of people involved in this history is quite impressive. It includes royalty, scientists, all kinds of private collectors and public collections and so on. But if we start with some of the early ones, we have to mention, of course, Rudolf II. We talked before about the Wunderkammer, but Rudolf II, of course, is pivotal, let's say, in this history as a collector of many things. But what about his fascinating for natural objects? What was that like?
Well, I think that it was absolutely comprehensive. I think that he wanted to assemble everything that he could, the whole world. He wanted that reflected in his Wunderkammer, which, of course, since the knowledge of the world was more limited than it is today, that was a sort of feasible ambition for a Baroque prince. But he loved strange things. He had a particularly outstanding collection of butterflies, but of course he also had a great herbarium. Unfortunately, all these things were scattered and destroyed when I think Prague was sacked after his death.
We Swedes might have a bit of an excuse here to
sore point. But anyway, we know that it existed, and you know, the natural world, the wonders of the natural world were, you know, displayed amongst the wonders of the finest art, finest craft. These things were seen as kind of on the same level, I think.
And also that is all connected. I mean, I think the main difference between our time and this time, both of the Renaissance but also later on, is of course we separate so rigorously between what is science and what is art and what is this and that, while in this sort of universe of ideas, it's all interconnected. There are no sort of clear boundaries yet between different departments, at least not in the way that it became later.
Yes, I think that ultimately the fantastic skill that could be shown by Leonardo da Vinci or whoever it might be was an example of what God could achieve on Earth alongside the wonders of the natural world. So I think they were thought of, I think, in the same sort of terms.
Now, Rudolf II, of course, as an emperor, and his collection was iconic, it was much discussed, it was hugely influential. But if we turn to a bit of a later time, we come to Hans Sloane and a more, let's say, scientific approach, if we can call it like that. Who was Hans Sloane, and how could we compare him to, let's say, royalties and nobilities collecting natural history objects?
Well, Hans Sloane was a doctor. I mean, he was, in a way, very like Rudolf II in that he collected everything. And his collection became the foundation of the British Museum. In our age, he is being kind of reevaluated a bit because his career started in Jamaica, where he went to be physician to the doctor. That's where to the governor. That's where he first got his big break, if you like. I think he possibly owned plantations. Certainly, his wife did, and so as a plantation owner and therefore a slave owner, he has been. That is regarded as a substantial black mark. But I think he came from Ireland. He certainly rose to a very high position in society in London. He was the doctor to the Queen, for example. But he, as I think going back to earlier periods in history, he had a great interest in plants because of their medical properties. When he was in Jamaica, he published a book about the flora of Jamaica, and when he came home, he collected. And he not only collected things that he himself could find, but he bought other people's collections. And I think this was quite a characteristic, that people's herbariums, if they were very interested, became bigger and bigger and bigger because they were buying collections that had already been formed. And he corresponded with people around the world insofar as that was possible, certainly around the empire, and he corresponded with European scholars, for example, and his collection was absolutely preeminent at the time. Unfortunately, that still exists because it's been preserved, I think, in the Natural History Museum.
So if we compare him to Rudolf II, we could say that in one sense they share this fascination for everything, basically. They're absolutely interested by everything around them. But at the same time, perhaps he is a bit more systematic and perhaps one step closer to a more quote-unquote scientific or even commercial value of doing this.
Yes, I don't know that he had much commercial, that he was driven by commercial considerations very much. I think that some of his contemporaries, to a certain extent, were Sloane he became a rich man through his work as a doctor and through his marriage. So he didn't have to worry so much, but some of his contemporaries wanted or made money by showing their collections. Of course, they were showing them, they were partly wanting to share them.
So the social prestige and, the PR value.
Well, I think that there was a prestige to doing this, and it was also, there was a network of people with whom you could correspond and swap and discuss these things. And I think that that was also an attractive aspect to people who were occupying a good position in society.
Another name, which is almost the first name that always comes up when you talk about this, is of course Carl von Linné in Swedish, Carl Linnaeus in English. And I thought I could actually quote him and read from his own lips, let's say. In 1735, he of course publishes his famous Systema Naturae, which transforms this entire world of collecting things and understanding nature. And he says, "The first step in wisdom is to know the things themselves. This consists in having a true idea of the objects. Objects are distinguished and known by classifying them methodically and giving them appropriate names. Therefore, classification and name-giving will be the foundation of our science." End quote here. Linnaeus is associated, primarily with systems, right? With giving these names, the so-called binomial system and so on. And now we are in the 18th century. Is this also a shift where, let's say, the earlier collecting was a bit more broad, a bit more general, and now it becomes more specific, more sort of focused on scientific ideals? What would you say about the 19th century and Linnaeus here as a shifting time period?
Well, yes, I think that classification was what Linnaeus was so interested in, so that he could understand the world that, as he saw it, God had created through ordering it. And previous attempts to do this had been much more complicated and unsatisfactory. He was, in a sense, a professional. He had always been fascinated by plants, and he was a university man, whereas Sloane had been a working doctor, for example. So, yes, I think we're seeing a greater kind of professionalism. But again, there's a network of scholars throughout Europe for whom this is something that they are all interested in together. So perhaps the network also is spreading. But Linnaeus made a tremendous impact on this whole subject, of course, obviously, principally through his system of classification, but even the way that he stored his herbarium sheets and how he kept them in cabinets. It was an example that was followed by many other people.
And today, as we mentioned, the original herbarium of Carl von Linné is actually in London, in ownership of the Linnaean Society.
Yes, it's a fantastic thing. After his death, his widow had the collection, and it was bought by somebody who was a great admirer of Linnaeus, and as luck would have it, he lived in London, and the Linnaean Society continues, and the work goes on. It's a learned society in Burlington House, which is where the Royal Academy is, but also where other learned societies are, and the herbarium is beautifully looked after in a temperature-controlled vault, which is under Piccadilly.
It's good. In central London. It's quite amazing.
Yes.
Now, if we move forward to Victorian times, then of course we have Darwin, yet again causing another revolution in how to think about this. And of course, the collecting continues in many different shapes and forms. But if we think about natural history collecting in Victorian times, we also have the museums, the public spaces where you can suddenly see this. What are the main sort of ideas here in Victorian times that shapes natural history collecting?
Well, of course, there was a tremendous furore over Darwin and his way of thinking, and the idea that there were things in the world that weren't catalogued in Genesis or even dreamt of by the writers of the Bible. That was a revolution which was very bitterly fought by people who were in the church, for example. So this was a huge debate. And while Darwin particularly wrote about birds and animals, it was possible to see the principles of evolution also in flora. Of course, it was an age where some buildings, like the Natural History Museum, which was here in London, which was built in the middle of the 19th century, were covered in representations of plants and animals, carved in stone. It was intensely important. The Pre-Raphaelites in art microscopically recorded plants in microscopic detail. John Ruskin is interesting in this respect because he grew up in a rather austere Christian tradition, but his interest in geology. He said the hammers were beating at his head, the hammers that cracked open stone and found fossils inside. These were destroying the basis of his faith. But at the same time, his art was based on a kind of minute and almost obsessive examination of the natural world, which was very like the collection of specimens in herbaria. I mean, many of his watercolours were never finished because he was looking at the things that grew in hedgerows, for example, in such intense detail that they could never be captured on any page. It was impossible even for him. But then he was a rich man. His father had been a sherry merchant, and so he didn't need the income from his. He didn't sell his paintings, so he didn't have to worry. They were purely for him. But it shows how important the natural world was, and particularly this extraordinary moment. It really made such an impact on the world in the 19th century. But Darwin's ideas. But also, you mentioned museums. Of course, they injected a whole new resource into the collecting of samples from the natural world. So it could be on a much greater scale and much more systematized than previous collectors who were really private people. Sometimes they had museums. The Ashmolean Museum contains the collection. It was based on the collection of some gardeners in the 17th century called Tradescant. So the Tradescants showed their collections at a museum called The Ark in Lambeth in London, and people paid a small amount of money to go and see them. But that was really a different tradition. These great museums, which were often supported by the resources of the towns in which they were in, or sometimes the government, they could do things on a much bigger scale and for a public who could come and see them.
Do you think that the rise of museums and public institutions in a way perhaps decreased the impulse to private collecting? I mean, you could just as well go to a museum, or do you think they might have stimulated at the same time?
Well, that's an interesting point. I mean, you might think that they, as it were, kind of scooped the pool, and that every private person would feel so outdone by the museums it wasn't worth it. But I don't think that's true. I think that it was something which, for example, clergymen and private gentlemen private gentlemen and ladies in the countryside, it was something that they could contribute to, that they could kind of be part of this whole movement. Clergymen, certainly in Britain, clergymen had played a great role in botany. They were very often people who first identified wildflowers when they were botanizing around their parish, and I think that tradition continued in the 19th century. It was part of a culture, really. I think it was something you could do and be part of a club. And indeed, there were lots of clubs for doing this.
Many societies and different organizations and so on grew and gathered all these people. Finally, today then, I mean, not many people have neither the patience nor the time and interest to collect things and press them against papers and so on. But what do you think, what should we take from this incredible history of natural history collecting today? What sort of main ideas and thoughts here do you think are valuable for us to reflect on today?
Well, I think there remains the scientific relevance of herbariums, which I mentioned earlier, but the spirit of wonder is brought alive when you look at these samples, which are kind of magical, that they have survived. These are the very plants growing at a certain period, which is maybe a couple of 100 years ago, and they can look like, well, dried leaves, which is what they are when you first see them on the herbarium page. But when you look really closely at them, there is the wonder of the detail in their structure and the thought that these very objects were alive at a particular point in history, which I think is stirring to the imagination. At least that's what I find.
The sense of wonder, that is certainly intact. It seems to me that there are so many things we can take from this history of natural history collecting. It is a very good way to understand how complex, how manifold the birth of science, the understanding of nature, and how we create really worldviews through this. And of course, then also all these extraordinary people who has been involved in this. But today, Clive, do you think that if we look into this history today, are the bits and pieces we can use not only to understand history, but actually understand where we are today?
Well, I think so. I think that there remains a sense of wonder, particularly, I mean, in the wonderful photographs in this book, they show these herbarium specimens in a way that you can't appreciate them just with the natural eye, and that in itself is a fabulous thing. But it's wonderful to think that these specimens have been collected on a certain day at a particular place, and they are a powerful connection across centuries, I feel. But also, these days, it's a very uncertain world. People lead very busy lives. Equally, we've lived through the COVID crisis when the world seemed to stop and people were no longer travelling so much. And whether this fully resumes, given the different crises of what we have today, I don't know. But there's a spiritual value in looking very closely at things, and things which might not be from the other side of the world, but might be from fields or from your own garden or from a hedgerow or a verge, which is just outside your own door. Looking at the particular has always got a spiritual value and engages the imagination, I think, but particularly today when it's a good thing to slow down.
There's certainly a lot more to reflect on. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Clive.
Thank you very much.
Tack för att du har lyssnat på Stolpe Stories. Missa inte att du som lyssnar har 20% rabatt på bokförlaget Stolpes titlar hos Bokus.com. Aktivera rabatten genom att ange koden STOLPE20. Och för att lyssna på fler avsnitt, följ oss där poddar finns och på sociala medier.